The universe had rules. Dr. Stephen Strange had spent 15 years learning that truth the hard way, first as a surgeon who believed only in what his hands could touch, then as a broken man climbing a mountain in Nepal to find that everything he dismissed as primitive superstition was, in fact, the load-bearing architecture of reality itself. Magic wasn't the absence of science. It was science operating in dimensions that science hadn't yet named. He knew this. He had staked his life on it approximately 400 times. None of that prepared him for what happened when the sanctum floor opened up and swallowed him whole. It had started as a containment ritual, straightforward by Kamartaj standards, which meant it was the kind of thing that could end a solar system if mishandled. A dimensional seam had been detected running beneath Greenwich, thin as a paper cut, vibrating at a frequency that made Wong's instruments produce readouts in languages that hadn't existed since the Vishanti rewrote the first laws. Strange had drawn the containment mandala himself, spoken the binding words in the correct order, and felt the seam begin to close. Then it had inhaled, not metaphorically. The breach had drawn breath the way a living thing draws breath, with intention, with hunger. And Strange had felt the eye of Agamotto go cold against his sternum for the first time in years. Cold like warning, cold like recognition. Then the sanctum floor was gone, and the world was gone, and there was nothing in every direction for what felt like a very long time. He materialized inside a wall, not through it, inside it. The molecules of his body and the composite titanium alloy of the bulkhead occupied the same space for approximately a third of a second before Strange's training kicked in and he instinctively pushed, a dispersal working, unplanned and rough, and stumbled backward into a corridor that smelled of recycled air and something faintly antiseptic, like a hospital that had forgotten it was a hospital. He stood there for a moment, hands raised in the defensive configuration that had become as natural as breathing, golden sling ring light already coalescing between his fingers. The corridor was curved, smooth, lit by panels that produced no visible bulb or flame. The floor hummed beneath his boots with the deep, regular vibration of something enormous moving. The walls were gray-beige, functional, and were designed by someone who believed that beauty was an inefficiency. The eye of Agamotto pulsed once, weakly, like a compass searching for north in a room made entirely of magnets. Strange lowered his hands slowly and looked in both directions. A young ensign in a gold-shouldered uniform rounded the curve of the corridor and stopped so abruptly that the PADD he was carrying clattered to the floor. He was perhaps 23 years old, with the specific expression of someone whose understanding of the possible had just been surgically removed and replaced with pure animal confusion. "That wall," the ensign said. That wall." "I'm aware," Strange said. "You came out of it." "I'm also aware of that." The ensign's hand moved towards something on his belt. Strange recognized the gesture. Not a weapon exactly, but the reflex of someone reaching for the protocol that explains situations like this. Strange almost sympathized. He'd had his own version of that reflex once. He'd called it rationalism, and he'd been wrong. "Don't," Strange said quietly. "Not a threat, a suggestion. Whatever you're about to call, I'd recommend waiting 60 seconds. I'm not a threat. I'm lost. I'm mildly concussed from passing through approximately 17 layers of dimensional membrane, and I have absolutely no idea where or when I am. Those are my only problems right now. I'd like to keep it that way." The ensign stared at him, took in the blue tunic, the deep burgundy cloak of levitation, shifting almost imperceptibly at Strange's shoulders, like a creature deciding whether to be interested, the silver-streaked temples, on the scarred hands hovering in careful neutrality. Then he tapped his communicator and said, in the voice of a man who had committed to a course of action and was already regretting it, "Ensign Harwick to bridge. I need a security team to Corridor 7, Deck 3, and possibly the captain." Strange looked down at the eye. It pulsed again, irregular, searching, and he felt the mystic arts respond sluggishly around him, like trying to start a car engine in weather 20 degrees below what it was designed for. The dimensional energy he habitually drew from was present, but thin, filtered through some different substrate he didn't have a name for yet. It was like breathing through cloth, workable, not comfortable, but from somewhere far above him, or perhaps simply in a direction that didn't map neatly onto above or below. He felt something vast and cold notice that he had arrived. He filed that away. Whatever had followed him through the breach, it hadn't fully crossed yet. He had time, assuming the security team was reasonably negotiable. The first one arrived 40 seconds later, a large Klingon in the same gold-shouldered uniform, with the bearing of a man who had personally decided that every stranger was a threat until proven otherwise, by written affidavit, and possibly not even then. He filled the corridor with professional menace and fixed Strange with the particular look of a warrior who was performing a calculation about exactly how much force would be appropriate. Strange met his eyes and didn't move. The Klingon's hand rested on his phaser. "You will identify yourself." "Dr. Stephen Strange," Strange said. "Sorcerer Supreme of Earth, though I suspect this isn't the Earth I was standing on 20 minutes ago." The Klingon's eyes narrowed. "Sorcerer. I understand that word probably isn't in your threat assessment protocols. I apologize for the inconvenience." From the far end of the corridor came measured footsteps. Deliberate, unhurried, the footsteps of someone who had long ago stopped being surprised and had instead become professionally curious. Strange turned. The man who walked toward him was trim, bald, somewhere in his mid-50s, with the posture of someone accustomed to being the most formidable mind in any room. He wore a uniform with different insignia from the others, command red at the shoulders. And his eyes were doing something Strange recognized immediately, because he had the same habit himself. They were cataloging, recording, assessing without conclusion. The man stopped at a respectful distance, looked at Strange with the particular expression of someone confronting a problem they find genuinely interesting. "I'm told," he said, in a voice that belonged in a lecture hall or a negotiation chamber, "that you walked out of my ship's wall." "Through it," Strange said. "Technically." "Technically." The man seemed to taste the word. "I'm Captain Jean-Luc Picard of the USS Enterprise, and I suspect, Dr. Strange, that you and I have a great deal to discuss. If you want to see more characters enter different universes, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below." Hope shines brightest in the darkest night. Picard had faced the Borg. He had been unmade by them, taken apart at the molecular level of his identity, rebuilt as something that wore his face and spoke tactical coordinates in a voice that had once read Shakespearean sonnets. And he had come back from that. He had negotiated with species that communicated in pure mathematics, reasoned with civilizations that experienced time backwards, and once talked a godlike entity out of destroying humanity on a Tuesday afternoon. He considered himself, without arrogance, a man of considerable philosophical range. He was finding Dr. Stephen Strange unusually difficult to categorize. They sat across from each other in Picard's ready room, a pot of Earl Grey steaming between them. Strange had accepted a cup with the automatic courtesy of a man whose manners operated independently of his circumstances, while the captain studied his guest the way he studied archaeological artifacts, with patience, with respect, and with the underlying recognition that some objects resisted interpretation not because they were meaningless, but because they were too meaningful. "You understand," Picard said, "that what you're describing is not possible." "I understand that it appears that way from your framework," Strange said. He held the teacup in both hands, and Picard noticed for the first time the extent of the scarring, the deep surgical precision of old nerve damage, the slight tremor in the left index finger that Strange had apparently learned to work around so completely it was nearly invisible. "But your framework has edges. Everything does. I've been to several of them. The mystic arts." Picard set down his own cup. "You're describing a system of what exactly? Manipulation of energy through ritual gesture and verbal formula? Manipulation of dimensional energy through trained perception and intent," Strange corrected, not unkindly. "The gestures and words are focusing mechanisms, training wheels essentially, until the practitioner develops sufficient neuroplasticity to work without them. The underlying reality they access is as concrete as your warp field equations. It simply operates in dimensions your instruments don't measure." "Clarke's third law," Picard said. Strange raised an eyebrow. You know, Clark, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. Picard leaned back. You're suggesting the inverse applies. I'm suggesting the distinction is meaningless at sufficient depth. Strange set down his cup. The cloak of levitation shifted at his shoulders, not dramatically, just the small adjustment of something alive settling into a new position. And Picard made a conscious effort not to react to it, though he noted it with precision. The universe you live in operates on physical laws. Mine does too. We simply live in universes with different complete sets of physical laws. What you call subspace, I might call the mirror dimension's outermost membrane. We're describing different faces of the same geometric object. Picard was quiet for a moment. And outside the ready room window, stars moved at impulse speed, slow and steady, the universe going about its business with the indifference of something very old. You're a scientist, Picard said finally. It wasn't an accusation. It was a recognition. I was a surgeon, Strange said, the best in the world by most objective measures. I was also the most arrogant man in several rooms simultaneously, which is an achievement given the rooms I was in. He said it without self-pity, with the flat matter-of-factness of someone who had processed that particular truth so thoroughly it had become simple data. The mystic arts didn't ask me to abandon scientific thinking. They asked me to extend it past the point where my instruments stopped working. That's all mysticism ever actually is, at its best. Me, science in the dark. Picard found himself unexpectedly moved by that framing. He had spent 30 years navigating the Federation's confident empiricism, its magnificent, necessary, occasionally insufficient belief that every phenomenon yielded to sufficient inquiry. And here was a man who had arrived through a wall and was describing the limits of measurement with the precision of a physicist. The anomaly that brought you here, Picard said, shifting to ground he felt more confident on. Our sensors detected a quantum-level disturbance approximately 40 minutes before you appeared. Subspace readings were inconsistent with any known phenomenon. Lieutenant Commander Data has been attempting to model it, so far without success. Data, Strange repeated. The android. Picard paused. Ooh, you've met him? I walked through your ship for approximately 4 minutes before your security team located me. He passed me in a corridor on Deck 5. He stopped, looked at me for about 2 seconds and said, Strange paused and something close to amusement crossed his face. You are generating an energy signature consistent with zero known Federation classifications, and your clothing suggests a cultural origin outside any catalogued spacefaring civilization. Fascinating. I will need to revise 17 assumptions. And then he continued walking. Picard felt the familiar warmth that Data's particular brand of innocent thoroughness always produced. That sounds precise. It was the most honest reaction I've gotten in years. Strange's expression settled back into its habitual gravity. Captain, I need to be direct with you, because time may matter. Whatever breach brought me here didn't close properly. I felt it when I arrived. A dimensional seam, still open, still vibrating. Whatever I inadvertently destabilized in my own universe when the breach inhaled, the instability followed me. It hasn't fully crossed yet, but if a dimensional breach remains open long enough in a region of space without an established mystical framework to contain it, it widens, Picard said. Strange looked at him with the first genuine surprise he'd shown. Yes, exactly. I'm familiar with the principle. We call it a quantum resonance cascade. The mathematics are different, but the behavior you're describing. Picard stood and moved to his computer terminal. May I show you something? Strange rose and stood beside him. On the screen, how Data's preliminary sensor analysis mapped a region of space approximately 3 light minutes off the Enterprise's port bow. A shimmer in the subspace readings that the computer kept trying to classify and kept failing, returning the same frustrated null result in 17 variations. Strange studied it for a long moment. The eye of Agamotto pulsed against his chest. 3 times, with something that felt distinctly like urgency. That's not a quantum resonance cascade, Strange said quietly. No, Picard agreed. I didn't think it was. It's a door. The ship's lights didn't flicker. There was no dramatic sound effect, but something in the quality of the silence between them changed. The specific silence of two careful minds arriving simultaneously at a conclusion neither wanted to be correct. "Mr. Data," Picard said, touching his communicator. "Meet me in the observation lounge in 10 minutes. Bring everything you have on the subspace anomaly." He paused. "And tell Counselor Troy her presence is requested." Strange was still looking at the sensor display. His scarred hands had curled slightly at his sides, not into fists exactly, but into the half-formed configuration of someone preparing to work. "Whatever came through that door with me," he said, "it didn't follow by accident." Deanna Troy had learned, over years of service aboard the Enterprise, to trust the sensation of wrongness before she trusted its explanation. She had felt it before the Borg cube dropped out of warp. She had felt it in the moment before Picard was taken. It arrived not as fear exactly, but as a kind of pressure behind the sternum. The empathic equivalent of a smoke detector, silent and insistent, designed to wake her before the fire was visible. She had felt it the moment Dr. Strange materialized on Deck 3. She felt it now, sitting across from him in the observation lounge with the stars wheeling slowly behind his shoulders. And she was doing her best to understand what precisely she was feeling, because it didn't match anything in her experience. And Deanna Troy had a great deal of experience. Most beings she encountered had emotional signatures she could read the way a musician reads a score. Some complex, some simple, some discordant, but always fundamentally recognizable as the emotional architecture of a living mind. Grief had a texture. Joy had a frequency. Even the Borg, in their terrible collective silence, had a quality she could perceive as the absence of individual feeling, which was itself a kind of reading. Dr. Strange had all of that. She could feel his exhaustion, deep and structural, the fatigue of someone who had been carrying weight for so long that putting it down had stopped feeling like an option. She could feel his discipline, which was almost architectural in its precision, the way it organized and contained. She could feel beneath both of those things a grief so thoroughly processed it had become something else. Not healed exactly, but integrated the way scar tissue integrates into skin. But beneath all of that, beneath the man, there was something else, something vast and layered and old. Like standing at the edge of a canyon and realizing the canyon went down further than light could follow. It wasn't malevolent. It wasn't even precisely his. It was more as though Strange existed at the intersection of several realities simultaneously, and the weight of all those realities was pressing gently against the inside of whatever room he occupied. She had never felt anything like it, and she found it simultaneously fascinating and deeply unnerving. "You're trying to read me," Strange said, without looking at her. He was studying Data's sensor analysis, spread across the lounge table in holographic projection. A map of the anomaly rendered in Federation blue and amber, patient and precise, and entirely inadequate to what it was actually depicting. "I'm an empath," Troy said. "I can't turn it off." "I know." Strange looked up then, but his eyes were steady, assessing, carrying the particular quality of someone accustomed to perceiving things others couldn't. "I've worked with telepaths, and I'm aware that what you're sensing is probably confusing. That's one word for it." She folded her hands on the table. "There are layers to you that don't feel like one person." "There are layers to me that aren't technically one person," Strange said. "Not anymore. The mystic arts leave marks. You spend enough time operating across dimensional membranes, and something of every dimension you've touched stays with you. I've been carrying the residue of about 47 distinct reality layers for the last several years." He paused. "I've been told it's disorienting to perceive from the outside." "Disorienting is generous," Troy said. Then, because she was a professional, "Is it painful? Carrying that?" Strange considered the question with the genuine seriousness it deserved, which was itself a kind of answer about who he was. "It was initially. Now it's more like," he searched for the word, "context. Every decision I make with the awareness of 47 ways it could go wrong across dimensional variants. It's not comfortable, but it's useful." At the far end of the table, Data had been building a file on his PAD with the systematic intensity of someone solving a proof. He looked up now with the expression he always wore when data points declined to cooperate with each other. Not frustrated exactly, since Data did not experience frustration, but deeply engaged in the way a puzzle engages a mind specifically structured for puzzles. I have completed an initial analysis of your energy signature, Data said. I have 17 distinct findings. Of course you do, Strange said. Finding 1, you are human, baseline, with no genetic modification detectable by our instruments. Finding 2, you are generating energy fields in 4 distinct frequency ranges, none of which correspond to any known energy type in Federation databases. Finding 3, the object around your neck. Data indicated the eye of Agamotto with a precise gesture, is producing a temporal distortion field with a radius of approximately 0.3 meters. Time within that radius is moving at 99.7% of normal speed. Finding 4, Data, Picard said gently. Sir? Perhaps findings 1 through 4 for now? Data nodded with the equanimity of someone who had learned to portion his observations for human processing speeds. Of course, Captain. Strange reached up and touched the eye. The temporal field, that's passive. It happens when the eye is in an environment with unstable time flow. It's compensating for something. Compensating for what? Picard asked. Strange looked at the anomaly map. For whatever is on the other side of that door, applying pressure to local spacetime. He traced a finger through the holographic display, not touching it, hovering just above the amber shimmer at the center of the projection. And the eye pulsed once in response. Captain, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer without the filter of what you believe is scientifically possible. Picard nodded once. Go ahead. In your experience of the universe, in everything your civilization has cataloged and explored, have you ever encountered something that behaved as though it existed between things? Not in space, not in time, but in the conceptual gap between one state of being and another? The silence that followed was interesting. Picard was still. Data tilted his head slightly, processing. Troy felt something shift in the room's emotional atmosphere. A collective hesitation, the feeling of several people deciding simultaneously how honest to be. It was Worf who spoke, Emery from his position near the door, where he had stationed himself with the immovable quality of someone who had decided the stranger warranted personal security attention, regardless of the captain's apparent comfort. The Klingon afterlife, Worf said. His voice carried the careful weight of a warrior discussing sacred things in secular company. Grathor, Stovokor, they are not described as places. They are described as... He paused, working through the translation. The space between a warrior's last breath and whatever comes next? Strange looked at him for a long moment. Something in his expression shifted. Not quite respect, but the acknowledgement of someone who had just been given an unexpectedly useful piece of information from an unexpected direction. Your afterlife mythology, Strange said slowly. It may be dimensional memory. Worf's eyes narrowed. Explain. Cultures that develop near-dimensional seams sometimes encode their geography into their mythology without realizing it. What your ancestors experienced as spiritual terrain, the Klingon between space, may have been genuine perception of dimensional membrane. Strange looked back at the anomaly, which means whatever is pressing against that door from the other side has been pressing against it long enough for your people to notice. The observation lounge was quiet. Outside its vast windows, the anomaly shimmered in the dark, patient, amber, waiting. Troy felt the pressure behind her sternum intensify. Q arrived the way Q always arrived, without invitation, without apology, and with the particular theatrical timing of someone who had been watching for long enough to know exactly when his entrance would cause maximum disruption. One moment, the observation lounge contained 5 people and a problem. The next moment, it contained 6. And the problem had developed a sense of humor. He was wearing, for reasons that were either deeply considered or entirely arbitrary, the uniform of a Starfleet admiral, crisp, decorated, projecting the specific authority of someone who had never needed authority because they had something considerably more comprehensive. He stood at the head of the table with his hands clasped behind his back and surveyed the assembled company with the expression of a collector who had just discovered an unexpected item at an auction. His eyes settled on Strange and stayed there. "Well," Q said, this is new." Picard set down his tea with the precise, controlled movement of a man exercising considerable restraint. "Q, Jean-Luc." Q did not look at him. He was still studying Strange with an intensity that was, for Q, remarkably focused. "You'll forgive me if I'm briefly distracted. I've been observing this little corner of the galaxy for some time, and I have never," he paused for emphasis, "never encountered a human being who smells like that." Strange had gone very still, not the stillness of fear. Troy could feel that clearly, the absence of it, but the stillness of a trained practitioner recognizing a category of threat and taking a precise mental inventory before responding. His hands rested flat on the table. The cloak of levitation had gone motionless in a way that felt, paradoxically, like heightened attention. "Smells like what exactly?" Strange said. Q tilted his head. "Like someone who has stood at the edge of everything and looked over and then, most unusually, most remarkably, looked away." He circled the table slowly, not quite threatening, the way a very intelligent predator moves when it is more curious than hungry. Most beings who approach that edge fall in, or are pushed, or spend the remainder of their existence trying to claw their way back to the comfortable middle where things have names and causes. He stopped behind Strange's chair. "You went to the edge deliberately, repeatedly, and you came back each time with souvenirs." "Q," Picard said, with the tone of someone who had learned that giving Q a direct order was functionally useless, but maintained the habit on principle. This is not the moment." "It's absolutely the moment, Jean-Luc. That's rather why I'm here." Q moved around to the side of the table and produced a chair from nowhere, sitting with the boneless ease of someone for whom furniture was a creative decision rather than a necessity. "Do you know what I am?" he asked Strange directly. Strange's eyes tracked him with the careful assessment of someone running probability calculations. "You're a Q," Strange said, "an omnipotent entity from a continuum beyond linear time. You interact with this crew regularly, usually to test them in ways that feel like sadism, but apparently constitute pedagogy." He paused. "You're also, if I'm reading the dimensional resonance correctly, profoundly uncomfortable right now." The observation lounge went very quiet. To Q's expression did something complicated, a series of micro-movements that resolved after a moment into something Strange had probably not expected to find on the face of an omnipotent being. Something that was not quite defensiveness and not quite unease but occupied the territory between them. "Profoundly is an overstatement," Q said. "Mildly uncomfortable," Strange offered. "Intrigued," Q said firmly. "I am intrigued. There is a significant difference." "Q." Strange leaned forward slightly. "I've negotiated with beings that predate your continuum. I've closed doors that entities older than this galaxy were trying to hold open. I have exactly zero interest in being your experiment, and negative interest in pretending I don't know what you are. So let's skip the theater." He kept his voice level, professional, stripped of any aggression that might read as challenge. "What do you actually want?" The silence stretched. Troy was watching Q with her full empathic attention, which was normally an exercise in navigating the bizarre, nonlinear emotional landscape of a being that experienced feeling the way humans experienced weather. Pervasively, from all directions, without obvious origin. But she caught something now beneath Q's performance that she had never felt from him before in all their encounters. Uncertainty, not the performed uncertainty of a being pretending to reconsider. Genuine, structural uncertainty. The feeling of a mind encountering a variable it did not have a category for, in finding the experience, against all expectation, interesting rather than threatening. Q looked at Strange for a long moment, and then he did something he almost never did. He answered the question directly. "The Q continuum has been aware of dimensional membrane for longer than your civilization has been aware of fire," Q said. "We exist across it, through it, in the spaces between states of being that your Klingon friend so poetically described as the warrior's last breath. He glanced at Worf, who received the attention with dignified suspicion. We have observed every civilization that has ever approached those membranes. We have watched them reach toward forces they called gods, demons, magic, the divine, terminology that maps, always, onto the same actual phenomenon, dimensional energy in its various grades and qualities. But, Strange said, but we have never, Q said, observed a biological being who learned to navigate it, not worship it, would not be destroyed by it, not be transformed into something post-biological by contact with it. He gestured at Strange with something that was almost frustrated admiration. You did something that, according to every model the continuum has developed, should be impossible. You learned to use the membrane the way we use it, with a biological nervous system and... He glanced at Strange's hands with a flicker of something that might have been sympathy. Damaged fine motor control. You are, Dr. Strange, deeply irritating to our understanding of what humans are capable of. Strange was quiet for a moment. I had a good teacher, he said. You had a teacher who was herself an impossibility, Q corrected. We were aware of the Ancient One. We are aware of Kamartaj, in the Sanctum Network, and the Vishanti. We have chosen not to intervene in your universe's mystical dimension because... He paused, and the pause carried the specific weight of a being who was about to say something true that they would prefer not to say, because it functions as a stabilizing system for dimensional membranes across your reality cluster. It is, in the continuum's estimation, doing necessary work. We don't interfere with necessary work. But something has interfered, Picard said quietly. Q looked at him then, and something passed between them. The long, complex, occasionally adversarial communication of two beings who had tested each other enough to have developed, against both their better judgments, something resembling mutual regard. Something came through that breach, Q said. Something that was on the other side of the membrane in your universe. A Doctor Strange, waiting, I suspect, for exactly the kind of destabilization that a mishandled containment ritual would produce. He stood. The Admiral's uniform disappeared, replaced by his usual black ensemble. It is not a Q. It is not anything the Continuum has cataloged with confidence. It is old, it is dimensional, and it arrived in this universe approximately 43 minutes ago, wearing your wake like a coat. Strange stood as well. The eye of Agamotto pulsed 3 times in rapid succession, and the golden light it cast threw sharp shadows across his face. Then we don't have as much time as I thought, Strange said. No, Q agreed. And then, in a tone Troy had never heard from him, stripped of performance, stripped of theater, in carrying the flat weight of genuine statement, he said, neither do we. The planet was called Viratus 4 in the Federation's stellar cartography database, which was the kind of name assigned by people who catalog things from a distance and never had to live on them. The inhabitants called it something that translated approximately as the ground that remembers, which was considerably more accurate given what was happening to it. It had been dying for 6 months by Federation reckoning. The away team had been dispatched 3 hours before Strange's arrival. Riker leading, with Dr. Crusher, Lieutenant Commander LaForge, and a junior science officer named Takahari, whose specialty was geophysical anomalies. They had beamed down to a civilization of approximately 400,000 people, watching their world's geological structure dissolve from the inside out, and they had spent 3 hours applying every instrument the Federation had developed across 2 centuries of scientific advancement to a problem that declined, politely but firmly, to be solved by any of them. Picard had made the decision to send Strange with the second away team himself. It had required approximately 90 seconds of internal deliberation, which for Picard, who could deliberate a tactical problem to its atomic components in the time it took most people to notice there was a problem, represented considerable hesitation. You understand, he'd said to Strange in the transporter room, that Starfleet protocol requires that I operate within a defined framework of non-interference, respect the Prime Directive's spirit if not its letter, given that this civilization already has Federation contact, and defer to Commander Riker's operational authority in the field, Strange said. I read the manual. Picard had paused. We don't have a manual for this. I know, I extrapolated the manual from context. Strange had adjusted the cloak of levitation at his shoulders. It had been doing something restless since Q's departure, the way a weather vane behaves in wind that hasn't arrived yet, and stepped onto the transporter pad. Captain, I'm not here to override your people. I'm here because whatever is killing this planet may be related to what followed me through the breach. If it is, out your instruments won't see it clearly. Mine might. That had been 30 minutes ago. Now Strange stood on a hillside above a settlement of pale stone buildings and watched the ground breathe. It was the only word for it. The geological instability Takahari had been analyzing with increasing desperation manifested as a rhythmic subsidence, the earth rising and falling in slow, regular pulses, like the chest of something sleeping, or something waking. Fissures ran through the settlement's central plaza in patterns that were, Strange could see immediately and with the specific clarity of dimensional sight, not random. They described a geometry, not the geometry of tectonic stress or mineral dissolution or any of the 17 competing hypotheses LaForge had been working through with the focused intensity of a man who believed every problem had an engineering solution. A different geometry, older, the kind that appeared in the marginal illustrations of text that Kamartaj kept in the restricted archive. Diagrams of places where dimensional membrane had worn thin enough for what lived between realities to press through and leave marks. You see something, Riker said beside him. The first officer had the professional watchfulness of someone who had learned to read people by their stillness as much as their movement, and Strange had been very still for the last 40 seconds. The fissure pattern, Strange said. It's not geological, it's dimensional. Something is pressing against the membrane from the other side, and the planet's physical structure is deforming around the pressure points. He crouched and placed one scarred hand flat against the hillside. Through the contact, through the faint, searching reach of mystic arts operating at reduced efficiency in this universe's different energy substrate, he felt it, like pressing your palm against a door and feeling something press back. It's been doing this for approximately 6 months, which matches your timeline. What's on the other side? Crusher asked. She was kneeling beside a fissure with her medical tricorder, running a geological analysis it was never designed to perform, her expression carrying the particular focus of a doctor confronting a pathology outside her training. Right now, pressure, intent, the leading edge of whatever came through the breach. Strange stood. It's been softening this location for months, using it as a test site. This planet isn't dying of a geological condition, Doctor. It's being prepared. LaForge looked up from his engineering scanner, and Strange could see, even without the dimensional sight, the specific frustration of an extraordinarily capable technician encountering the limits of his tools. Prepared for what? For a larger crossing. Whatever this entity is, it doesn't move the way matter moves. It doesn't punch through dimensional membrane. It dissolves it slowly from the other side until the barrier becomes permeable enough to allow passage without the kind of catastrophic energy release that would attract attention. Strange looked at the fissure pattern again, and the geometry pulsed faintly in his dimensional sight. Amber, rhythmic, patient. This planet is a doorway being widened. The silence that followed had the quality of a crew collectively revising their understanding of the situation they were standing in. Riker's hand moved to his communicator. Riker to Enterprise. Wait, Strange said quietly. Not urgently, with the particular calm of someone who needed 15 more seconds of information before the situation became actionable. There are people in that settlement. 400,000, Takahari said. Her voice was carefully neutral in the way of someone holding professional composure over genuine horror. And the entity that's been pressing against this membrane for 6 months? Strange tracked the fissure geometry with his eyes, calculating, has been doing it gently enough not to kill them, which means it wants them alive. Why? Riker asked. Strange was quiet for a moment. In the valley below, a child ran across the breathing plaza, unaware, chasing something. A ball, perhaps, or an animal. with the uncomplicated joy of a being whose world had not yet explained itself fully enough to be frightening. Dimensional entities of this class, Strange said, keeping his voice low and level, use biological presence as an anchor. Living minds generate something, a resonance, an energy, a quality of attention that helps stabilize a crossing point. 400,000 minds, focused by 6 months of low-grade geological fear, primed toward the same emotional frequency, he paused, are approximately equivalent to a sanctum-grade containment array. Except instead of containing the breach, they're feeding it. They're being used as a beacon, Crusher said. As fuel, Strange corrected gently. Captain Picard needs to know this. Riker was already opening the channel, but Strange had already crouched again, both hands on the hillside now, eyes closed, the eye of Agamotto flaring with soft golden light that the afternoon sun of Viridius IV caught and scattered in directions. Light wasn't supposed to go. He was listening to the membrane, feeling the rhythm of the pressure against it, the patience of it, the age of it, and underneath the patience, barely perceptible, the specific quality of attention that meant something on the other side knew he was there. LaForge knelt beside him, his visor tracking the golden energy output with the expression of a man watching something his instruments were describing perfectly, and his comprehension was failing to keep up with. "What are you doing?" "Introducing myself," Strange said. "If it already knows I'm here, there's no value in pretending otherwise." He pressed his palms flatter against the ground. The fissures pulsed in response, a single, slow, deliberate beat, like a heart acknowledging a knock. "Is that wise?" LaForge asked. "Probably not," Strange said, "but wisdom and necessity aren't always the same address." Above them, the Enterprise hung in orbit, its sensor arrays producing readouts that meant nothing and everything simultaneously. The universe trying to explain itself in a language it hadn't developed yet. The entity had a name. Strange found it the way he found most things in the dark. By moving carefully, by listening more than reaching, by respecting the difference between knowledge and understanding before he had earned the latter. He found it in the membrane itself. Dimensional membranes, at their deepest structural level, were not blank. They accumulated, the way geological strata accumulated, the way scar tissue accumulated, the residue of everything that had ever pressed against them from either side. Intentions left marks. Passages left marks. Long patience left the deepest marks of all, the slow compression of wanting something for longer than most civilizations lasted. Strange had learned to read those marks at Camartage, in the restricted archive. In the 3 years after Thanos, when the surviving Masters had cataloged every breach and seam and soft spot in their reality's membrane, and built a taxonomy of what lived on the other side. What had pressed against Viridius IV for 6 months had pressed against other things before that. Many other things. Over a very long time. The Masters had a word for it. Vithara, not its name. Dimensional entities of this class didn't carry names the way biological beings carried names, as identity markers, as social tools. The word described a category. A Vithara was a dimensional presence that moved between realities the way a deep ocean current moved between bodies of water. Not dramatically, not with force, but with the patient inevitability of something following a gradient too fundamental to resist. They didn't invade. They arrived, slowly and completely. And the membrane they crossed through dissolved behind them, permanently, because a Vithara didn't use a door so much as become the threshold. The one pressing against Viridius IV had been doing so for an estimated 300 years in Strange's universe before his mishandled ritual had destabilized the membrane enough to give it the opening it needed. It had followed his wake through the breach the way smoke follows a draft, not chasing him, not targeting him, simply using the path of least resistance he had accidentally created. It was here now, in this universe, still mostly on the other side of the membrane, still in the slow process of crossing, but here enough that the planet below was breathing in its rhythm and 400,000 people were dreaming its geography. Strange sat across from Picard in the observation lounge again. The away team recalled, the planet's population under gentle Federation monitoring, Riker coordinating evacuation options with the diplomatic delicacy required when you were trying to move 400,000 people off a world they had lived on for 2,000 years, without explaining that their home was being consumed from the inside by a dimensional current, and laid out everything he knew. Picard listened without interrupting. This was one of the things Strange had come to recognize about him in the hours since his arrival. The man listened the way he did everything else, with his complete attention organized into a directed instrument. Most people listen while simultaneously constructing their response. Picard listened as though the information itself mattered more than what he would eventually say about it. When Strange finished, Picard was quiet for a moment. 300 years, he said. At minimum. The membrane compression patterns suggest it may have been building pressure for considerably longer than that. But the active dissolution began approximately 3 centuries ago. Before Federation contact with this region, Picard said. Before we had any instruments in this area capable of detecting the anomaly. He stood and moved to the window. The stars were stationary at full stop. Picard had ordered the Enterprise to hold position relative to the anomaly after Strange's report from the surface. It predates our presence here entirely. Your presence isn't relevant to it, Strange said. That's important to understand. Why this isn't a response to the Federation or to human expansion or to anything your civilization has done. The Vithara follows gradients that were established before your sun ignited. You happen to have a settlement in the path of one. Small comfort to the 400,000 people living on it. No, Strange agreed, but relevant to how we approach the problem. This isn't malicious. The Vithara doesn't have malice any more than a river has malice. It doesn't want those people to suffer. It simply doesn't weight their existence against its own movement. He paused. That distinction matters because malicious entities can be negotiated with, convinced, redirected by appeal to self-interest. A Vithara can't be negotiated with. It doesn't have interest in the relevant sense. It just moves. Then how do you stop it? Picard asked. Shoo, you don't stop it, Strange said. You redirect it, change the gradient, make the path of least resistance point somewhere other than here. He pulled the eye of Agamotto away from his chest slightly. It hung on its chain, pulsing with that searching, irregular rhythm it had maintained since his arrival, still adapting to this universe's different dimensional substrate. In my universe, a redirect of this scale would require a sanctum grade working, multiple masters, prepared arrays, weeks of preparation, a dimensional anchor strong enough to absorb the redirected flow without itself being destabilized. And here, Strange set the eye down on the table between them. It sat there, pulsing, casting faint golden light across the tabletop in a pattern that was, Data would note later, reviewing the sensor logs, not random. Fractally organized, dimensional notation rendered in photons. Here, Strange said, I don't have a sanctum. I don't have prepared arrays. I don't have other masters. He looked at Picard steadily. What I have is a universe with its own energy architecture that I've been adapting to for approximately 6 hours. Your subspace field theory operates on principles that map, at sufficient depth, onto dimensional membrane mechanics. Your warp technology is essentially controlled membrane compression. You're already doing a version of what I do. You've just been doing it in the physical dimension rather than the dimensional one. Picard turned from the window. Something had shifted in his expression. The specific alertness of a mind that had just seen a connection it hadn't seen before and was rapidly examining its implications. You're suggesting, Picard said carefully, that we use the Enterprise. I'm suggesting that a starship capable of folding space-time for propulsion, operated by a crew that includes a being with motherbox integration. Strange nodded toward the door, beyond which Picard's crew went about their work. And commanded by a man who has personally navigated Q-level reality distortions, might constitute an adequate equivalent to a sanctum array if someone can explain to your chief engineer what he's actually building. Picard was quiet for a long moment. Geordi, he said finally, with the tone of a man who had made a decision and was already thinking 3 steps past it, is going to find this either deeply troubling or the most interesting problem of his career. In my experience, Strange said, yes, those are usually the same thing. Picard touched his communicator. Picard to LaForge. Report to Holodeck 2. Bring your full engineering team. A pause. And Mr. Data, I need you to learn something that isn't in any database we have. Strange picked up the eye. It pulsed against his palm. Stronger now, more certain, the searching quality beginning to resolve into something that felt cautiously like orientation, like a compass that had finally found north. Outside the observation lounge windows, the anomaly shimmered in the dark. Patient, amber, vast. 3 light minutes away and already present everywhere, the way the deepest currents were present everywhere in the water above them, invisible and irresistible. Strange looked at it and felt, for the first time since the sanctum floor had opened, something adjacent to a plan. The holodeck had been configured to display nothing. No program running, no simulation active, just the bare grid of the emitter floor glowing faintly amber in the darkness. The structural skeleton of a room that could be anything. Strange had asked for this specifically. He needed a space that wasn't pretending to be something else. LaForge stood at the center of the grid with his arms crossed and the expression of a man who had been asked to build a bridge between two continents using materials he had never touched, across a gap he couldn't measure, in a time frame that kept getting shorter. It was not, strictly speaking, different from his normal working conditions, but the variables were considerably more unusual. "Walk me through it again," LaForge said. "And from the membrane." Strange drew the diagram in the air with his hands. Not mystical energy, just gesture, the physical notation of a concept. Dimensional membrane is the boundary between adjacent reality states. Your universe and the space the Vathara is crossing from are adjacent realities separated by membrane. The membrane has a specific tension, a resistance to crossing, that's maintained by the ambient energy of both realities pressing against it from their respective sides. Like pressure equalization, LaForge said. Exactly like pressure equalization. When the pressure differential across the membrane increases, when one side becomes energetically dominant, the membrane thins. Given sufficient differential, it becomes permeable. The Vathara has been increasing the pressure on the far side for 300 years. 1 Viridis 4 became the thinnest point because the geological composition of the planet resonated with the Vathara's energy frequency. Strange moved his hands to indicate the next phase. What we need to do is artificially increase this universe's pressure on its side of the membrane at the crossing point. Not enough to damage the membrane. That would be catastrophic in the other direction. Enough to restore equilibrium. Enough to make the gradient point away from this location. "Push back," LaForge said. "Push back," Strange confirmed. LaForge turned to Data, who was standing to his left with a PAD in each hand, and the expression of a being processing information at speeds that made the conversation around him feel like slow motion. "Data, the warp field. A standard warp field generates a subspace compression bubble approximately equivalent to..." Data paused, recalculating with the fractional second timing of a positronic brain revising its own math. 10 to the power of 47 ergs of dimensional pressure if the field geometry is inverted to project outward rather than wrap the vessel. He looked at Strange. "Is that sufficient?" Strange had been doing his own calculation. "It's close. It's within an order of magnitude of what we need. The gap could be bridged if the warp field output is augmented by a secondary energy source operating in the correct frequency range." He touched the eye of Agamotto. "The eye generates temporal dimensional energy. It's been adapting to this universe's substrate since my arrival. If I can interface it with the warp field as a frequency modulator..." "Interface it how?" LaForge asked. His visor was tracking Strange's energy output with the continuous attention it gave to anything generating readings outside normal parameters, which meant it had been pointed at Strange with unusual consistency since the away team returned. "The eye doesn't have an interface port. It doesn't run on any energy standard I can identify. It doesn't have connectors, Dr. Strange. It's a magical artifact. It's a dimensional energy transducer with a biological interface," Strange said. "The biological interface is me. I connect it to the warp field by operating both simultaneously. The eye modulates my output to match the warp field's frequency. The warp field carries that modulation to the membrane at sufficient scale." He looked at LaForge steadily. "I become the connector." LaForge absorbed this. What does that do to you? Unclear, Strange said. That's not reassuring. No, Strange agreed, it isn't. But the alternative is allowing the Vithara to complete its crossing, at which point the membrane at Viridis 4 dissolves permanently, and you have a dimensional current running through the middle of your universe with no containment and no redirect possible. Because once a Vithara fully crosses the gradient, it establishes is irreversible. He paused. Unclear risk to one person versus certain catastrophic outcome for a significantly larger number. The math isn't complicated. LaForge looked at him for a long moment with the visor's unreadable glow. Then he turned to his engineering team. Three specialists who had been standing at the periphery of the conversation with the expressions of people watching two different languages become improbably mutually intelligible, and said with the calm authority of a man who had decided, "Okay, we're building it. Chen, I need the warp field geometry equations on screen. Patel, start modeling an inverted projection array. Yoshi, you're on power calculations. We're going to need everything the ship can generate without compromising life support or structural integrity." The engineering team moved with the focused efficiency of people who trusted their chief implicitly and had learned that the most unusual problems were usually the most interesting ones. Data set down one of his PADDs and picked up a stylus. "Dr. Strange, I will need precise specifications for the eye's energy output frequency in this universe's substrate. I am aware that you may not have complete data on this, as you have been adapting to our physics for approximately 9 hours. However, any data you can provide will allow me to build a more accurate model." "I can give you real-time readings," Strange said. "The eye responds to intent as much as measurement. If I operated at increasing intensity levels while your sensors monitor the output, we can map the frequency curve empirically." "That is an elegant solution," Data said, with a particular warmth he brought to elegance when he encountered it. "It also means we will need approximately 4 to 6 hours of calibration before the array is ready to deploy." "How long until the Vithara completes its crossing?" LaForge asked. Strange closed his eyes briefly, reached with the diminished but adapting sensitivity of his dimensional perception toward the anomaly 3 light minutes away, felt the membrane's current thickness, the rate of dissolution, the patient, inexorable pressure of something 3 centuries in motion. 18 hours, he said. Possibly 20. "Then we have time," LaForge said. "We have time if nothing changes," Strange corrected. "But something changed 6 hours ago when I introduced myself to it from the hillside. It knows I'm here now. It knows I'm a practitioner. It may—" The ship shuddered, not violently, not the dramatic lurch of weapons impact or collision. A single, slow, deep resonance, like a bell struck at a frequency below hearing, he felt in the chest rather than the ears, that passed through the Enterprise from bow to stern and left behind a silence that was somehow different from the silence before it. Every light on the holodeck grid pulsed once. Amber, the exact amber of the anomaly. LaForge spun toward his team. "Report." "Subspace readings across the ship just shifted," Patel said, her voice careful and controlled. "It's like—" She checked her display, rechecked it, looked up. "It's like something very large just noticed us." Strange was already moving toward the door. "It adjusted its timeline," he said. "It knows what we're planning." "How?" LaForge demanded. "Because I told it," Strange said, and his voice carried the flat weight of a man owning a decision he had made with full knowledge of the cost. "When I introduced myself on the hillside, I wasn't just announcing my presence. I was operating the eye. It read the eye's energy signature, read the dimensional intent behind it, and it understood that I was here to stop it." "You told it we were coming," LaForge said. "I told it I was coming," Strange said. "That's different. It wasn't going to remain ignorant regardless. But yes." He stopped at the holodeck door. The cloak of levitation was fully alert now, lifted slightly from his shoulders like a creature standing at the edge of a run. "We have less than 18 hours, possibly considerably less." He looked back at LaForge, at Data, at the engineering team suspended in the amber-tinged light of a room that was, for the moment, just its bones. "How fast can you work?" LaForge looked at his team. As something passed between them, the specific communication of people who had built the impossible before and were prepared to do it again. Faster than that, LaForge said. The calibration took 3 hours and 40 minutes, which was 40 minutes faster than Data's most optimistic projection, and approximately 14 hours faster than any sane engineering timeline would have allowed. LaForge achieved this through the specific alchemy of his best work: equal parts technical brilliance, intuitive improvisation, and the particular stubbornness of a man who had decided that the laws of physics were negotiable if you argued with them respectfully and at sufficient volume. Strange contributed something LaForge would later describe in his technical log with characteristic precision and characteristic understatement, one as an entirely new branch of applied physics that will require years of study to fully document. They worked in engineering, the holodeck having been abandoned for the genuine article. The warp core's blue-white column throwing light across consoles and crew with the steady pulse of a heart that moves stars. Strange stood at a secondary station LaForge had reconfigured for the purpose, the Eye of Agamotto open and active, generating output that Data measured in real time and translated into frequency curves that had no precedent in Federation science, and kept producing results that made Patel quietly set down her coffee and stare. The Eye, Strange had explained, was not responding to his universe's dimensional substrate anymore. It had finished adapting. It was responding to this universe's subspace, drawing from it, resonating with it, learning the particular flavor of a reality where minds traveled faster than light and matter could be disassembled and reassembled by beams of directed energy, and the fabric of space-time was routinely folded for convenience. The Eye found this universe's energy signature, after initial confusion, genuinely interesting. Strange suspected it was the first time the Eye had encountered a civilization that had accidentally been doing dimensional mechanics for 2 centuries without realizing it. The warp field geometry is set, LaForge said, not looking up from his console. His visor swept the readings with the continuous attention of someone monitoring a dozen variables simultaneously. Inverted projection array is ready to deploy on my mark. The problem, he finally looked up, is the frequency matching. The warp field runs on a subspace compression principle. Your Eye runs on, he gestured at Data, a dimensional resonance principle that operates at a frequency approximately 0.7 orders of magnitude above our subspace band, Data said. The gap is not insurmountable, but bridging it requires a precise modulation that our standard field coils cannot achieve. They are not designed for frequencies in this range. But I am, Strange said. You are the modulator, Data agreed. The question is what the modulation process will do to your nervous system, as you are the biological interface through which 2 incompatible energy systems will be simultaneously operating. He tilted his head with the precision of someone delivering an assessment they know will be unwelcome, but deliver anyway because accuracy matters more than comfort. After the stress on your neural pathways could be considerable. Define considerable, Strange said. I cannot, Data said. There is no precedent. I can tell you that the energy passing through you will be roughly equivalent to what a standard EPS conduit carries at 340% rated capacity. And what happens to an EPS conduit at 340% rated capacity? Data paused 1/4 of a second. It fails. Right, Strange said. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the warp core's steady pulse. But a conduit is passive. It carries energy without engaging with it. I'm not a conduit. I'm an active system. I can work with the energy, shape it, distribute the load across multiple processing channels. He looked at his scarred hands. The tremor in the left index finger was slightly more pronounced than usual. The dimensional work of the past hours, accumulating in nerve pathways that had never fully healed from the accident that had broken him into the shape of who he now was. I've operated at this edge before. You've operated at this edge in your universe, LaForge said, with a dimensional substrate you've spent years learning. This is a different substrate. It's a related substrate, Strange said. Different dialect, same language. He flexed his left hand once, deliberately, feeling the resistance of damaged nerves answering imperfectly. The question isn't whether I can do it. The question is whether I can do it before the Vethor completes its crossing. The ship shuddered again. Not the single resonant pulse from earlier, but something more sustained. And a low harmonic vibration that the structural integrity field absorbed without drama, but that every person in engineering felt as a pressure behind the eyes and a faint metallic taste at the back of the throat. The warp core's blue pulse flickered once. Membrane dissolution is accelerating, Data said, reading from his pad. The Vithara has increased its crossing rate by approximately 34% in the last 2 hours. At current rate, complete crossing will occur in a fractional pause. 11 hours, revised down from 18. It's pushing, LaForge said. It's responding to our preparation, Strange said. It knows what we're building. It's trying to complete the crossing before we can deploy. He picked up the eye, held it in both hands, felt the way it sat in this universe's energy. Settled now, certain. Reoriented in a way it hadn't been 9 hours ago. Geordie, how long to full deployment readiness? LaForge ran the calculation with his eyes moving across 4 consoles simultaneously. 2 hours if nothing goes wrong. Define nothing going wrong. No additional membrane acceleration, no system failures, no. LaForge stopped, his visor fixed on the warp core readout with the sudden total stillness of someone seeing something they weren't expecting. The warp core frequency is shifting. The engineering team moved simultaneously. Patel was at her console in 2 steps, Chen right behind her. Data had already begun running diagnostics with the smooth urgency of a being that didn't have adrenaline, but had developed excellent functional equivalence. It's the subspace harmonic, Patel said. Something is resonating with the warp core from outside the ship, matching frequency, trying to... She worked the controls with fast, precise hands. It's trying to detune the field coils. Strange was at the console beside her before she finished speaking. He placed one hand flat on the console surface, not operating it, not interfacing with it in any technical sense, but reaching through it with the dimensional perception that 9 hours of adaptation had sharpened from blunt instrument to something approaching its usual precision. He felt the warp core's energy, felt the external resonance pressing against it. Patient, vast, not aggressive exactly, but inexorable in the way that deep water is inexorable when it finds a crack. It's not attacking the ship, Strange said. It's adjusting the gradient. It's trying to make the warp field geometry inhospitable for the inverted array. He looked at LaForge. It's not trying to destroy us. It's trying to make our solution impossible without harming us. That's, LaForge started. Intelligent, Strange said. Yes, I told you it wasn't malicious. Malice is reactive. This is strategic. He straightened. Geordie, I need you to trust me for approximately 90 seconds. LaForge looked at him. The visor's amber glow was unreadable as always, but his expression beneath it was not. It carried the specific quality of a man who had worked with enough extraordinary people to know that there were moments when trust had to precede understanding. Go, LaForge said. Strange closed his eyes, both hands lifted. The familiar configuration, the gestures that were not magic but focus, not power but direction. The eye of Agamotto flared open with golden light that threw every shadow in engineering hard and certain against the walls. He reached outward, not with his hands, with the dimensional perception that was his most fundamental tool, the sense that had replaced the one he'd lost when his hands stopped being sufficient instruments, and found the Vithara's resonance pressing against the warp core. He didn't push back against it. He let it in, not all the way, not surrendering. The way a trained fighter absorbs a strike rather than blocking it, yielding enough to redirect, to understand the force's nature through contact, to find its frequency from the inside rather than the outside. The Vithara's energy moved through his dimensional perception like cold water through open hands, vast and directionless and very old. And there, inside its frequency, the gradient, the path of least resistance it was following, the line it had been tracing for 3 centuries toward this location. Strange mapped it in 2 seconds of contact that felt considerably longer. Then he closed his hands and pushed, not against the Vithara, but along its own gradient in the direction it was already moving, deflecting the resonance sideways by the precise minimum necessary to clear the warp core frequency. The external harmonic shifted, moved, disengaged from the field coils. The warp core's pulse steadied. LaForge exhaled once. with control. How did you... I used its own movement against it, Strange said. His voice was steady, but the tremor in his left hand had spread to include the whole hand now, a fine constant vibration he controlled by keeping it deliberately still. Geordie, we need to be ready in 90 minutes, not 2 hours. LaForge turned to his team. No deliberation, no hesitation. You heard him. Move. Data was already moving, his PADD tracking 17 variables simultaneously. His positronic brain running the revised timeline against every system on the ship and finding, not without effort, not without cost, a path through. They deployed at the 90-minute mark exactly. The Enterprise moved to within 1 light minute of the anomaly at 1/4 impulse, close enough for the inverted warp field array to reach the membrane with sufficient intensity, far enough that the Vathara's increasing dissolution pressure didn't compromise the ship's structural integrity field. On the view screen at the bridge's forward station, the anomaly had changed. It was no longer the subtle amber shimmer of the sensor display. It was visible now to the naked eye, a region of space where the stars behind it bent slightly, refracted by the membrane's thinning, the way light bends at the edge of a lens. The geometry of it was beautiful in the specific way that dangerous things are sometimes beautiful. The way a fault line is beautiful. The way a storm front is beautiful. The aesthetics of enormous forces in motion. Picard stood at the center of the bridge with his hands clasped behind his back and the posture of a man who had made his decision and was standing in it fully. The bridge crew moved around him with the focused quiet of people doing the most important work of their careers and knowing it. Worf was at tactical, running continuous threat assessments on a situation his threat assessment protocols had no category for, and adapting in real time with the specific stubbornness of a Klingon warrior who had decided that the absence of a category was not the absence of a threat. Riker stood to Picard's right, watching the view screen with the expression of a first officer calculating contingencies. Troy was at her station, her eyes half closed, her empathic attention extended toward the anomaly with the careful reach of someone listening to a sound at the edge of hearing. Strange stood at a position LaForge had cleared for him at the engineering station on the bridge's port side. The eye of Agamotto hung open against his chest, fully active, so generating a steady golden light that the bridge's illumination didn't quite absorb. It sat on top of the ambient light, additional and certain, casting the station's surfaces in warm tones that belonged to a different universe's physics. His hands were at his sides. The cloak of levitation hung perfectly still in the way it only hung when it was paying complete attention. Inverted array is online, LaForge reported from engineering, his voice through the comm carrying the controlled tension of a man monitoring 17 simultaneous variables and trusting each one in sequence. Field geometry is holding at the revised configuration. Ready to project on your mark, Captain. Dr. Strange, Picard said without turning. Are you ready? Strange looked at the view screen, at the place where the stars bent. Felt the Vathara's pressure against the membrane. Enormous, patient, 3 centuries of momentum behind it. The gradient it had been following since before the Federation existed, pressing forward with the indifference of a force of nature toward its conclusion. He thought of the Ancient One, of her particular way of standing at the edge of the impossible and treating it as simply the next problem. He thought of Wong, who would have had a list of 17 reasons this plan was inadequate and would have helped execute it anyway, because 17 reasons insufficient was still more adequate than doing nothing. He thought of the sanctum's floor opening under him, the breach inhaling, and the cold certainty of the eye going dark against his sternum. He thought of 400,000 people on a world below them, honor dreaming the geography of something that had been using their fear as fuel for 6 months without their knowledge or consent. Ready, Strange said. Engage, Picard said. The Enterprise shuddered, not the passive resonance of the Vathara's pressure, but its own active shudder, the full-body engagement of a starship turning its engines inward, inverting the geometry that normally wrapped space around itself to move through it, and instead projecting that geometry outward like an opened hand. The warp field expanded away from the hull in a configuration that had no name in the Federation's engineering database because no one had ever built it before. a wave of compressed subspace energy moving outward at the speed of light toward the thinning membrane 3 light-minutes away. Strange raised his hands. The geometry required was specific, not the broad, sweeping gestures of a major working. Those were for situations where precision was less important than scale. This required the fine work, the surgical work, the work his hands had been designed for in the life before Nepal and had been redesigned for in the life after it. The tremor in his left hand was there. He worked with it the way he always worked with it, not ignoring it, not fighting it, incorporating it into the precision the way a musician incorporates the natural resonance of their instrument into their playing. The damage was part of the instrument now. It had been for years. He reached through the warp field with the eye's dimensional perception and felt the membrane. It was thin, dangerously thin in the region directly above Viridis 4, translucent almost the way ice gets before it breaks. The way the last pages of a very old book feel when you turn them carefully and still feel them threatening to come apart. The Vithara was present on both sides of it now, most of its mass still on the far side, pressing, but tendrils of it already crossing, already establishing anchor points in the subspace of this reality, already beginning the process of making itself the gradient rather than following one. Strange felt those anchor points like cold fingers pressed against the inside of his perception. He began to work. The principle was redirection, not destruction. A Vithara couldn't be destroyed any more than a current could be destroyed, and attempting destruction would produce the dimensional equivalent of a dam failure, the redirected energy catastrophically reinforcing the crossing rather than preventing it. What the principle was the same one he had used in engineering against the warp core resonance. Find the gradient, use the gradient's own momentum, deflect it along a path of lower resistance than the one it was currently following. The warp field was the scale. LaForge had built him an instrument capable of matching the Vithara's dimensional pressure at the membrane. Strange was the frequency modulator, the interface between the warp field's subspace energy and the dimensional membrane mechanics he understood in his nervous system, the way a surgeon understood anatomy. The eye flared. The golden light expanded outward from Strange's position in a wave that passed through the bridge's physical surfaces without interacting with them. Through consoles, through stations, through Picard's uniform, through Worf's tactical display, and emerged on the other side unchanged, operating in a dimensional register that the ship's matter simply didn't intersect. Several bridge crew members gasped involuntarily. Troy's eyes opened fully, wide, her empathic sense catching the dimensional working as a sensation entirely outside her experience. Not emotional, not mental, something more fundamental. The feeling of reality being held carefully in very careful hands. The energy hit the membrane, and the Vithara pushed back, not with the subtle resonance adjustment it had used against the warp core. With everything, 3 centuries of momentum, vast and cold and completely without anger, the force of a deep current that had been moving in one direction for longer than Strange's civilization had existed and had no concept of stopping. It came back down the channel Strange had opened through the warp field like water rushing through a breach, following the path of least resistance in the only direction available, directly through him. The pain was extraordinary. Strange had experienced dimensional overload before. The moments in his training when the Ancient One had pushed his perception past its limits deliberately, to show him where they were, to teach him to work at the edge of them without going over. He had experienced it in battle, when dark dimensional entities had pushed back against his workings with forces that bypassed his physical defenses and struck the nervous system directly. He knew what it felt like. He had categorized it as he categorized everything and worked with the category the way he worked with the tremor in his hand. As data, as instrument, one as information about the situation rather than reason to stop. This was categorically different. The Vithara's energy was not hostile. That was almost the worst part. It wasn't trying to hurt him. It wasn't capable of trying anything in the relevant sense. It simply moved through him the way a current moves through water, following the gradient, indifferent, vast, 3 centuries of momentum, translated through the eye and through his nervous system and through the warp field interface simultaneously. And his nervous system was, as data had projected, not rated for this. He felt his legs go. Caught himself with a working that was more reflex than intention. A stabilization field generated by the cloak in the same moment it assessed that he was falling and calculated that falling was unacceptable. He stayed upright. His vision went to pure dimensional sight. The physical bridge disappeared and was replaced by the membrane, vast and thinning, and the Vitharas crossing, and the warp field pressing against it, and the gradient he needed to find, the path of lower resistance that would redirect this force away from this location. He found it in the pressure itself. The Vithara was following a gradient established 3 centuries ago toward Viridis IV's specific geological resonance. But geological resonance wasn't fixed, it was dynamic. A planet changed, and a planet in the process of having its dimensional membrane dissolved by 3 centuries of Vithara pressure had changed considerably. The dissolution process had altered the resonance frequency of Viridis IV's geological structure in ways that the Vethara's 3 century-old gradient no longer perfectly matched. There was a gap, fractional, temporary, but real. Strange drove the warp field into it. He didn't redirect the Vethara away from Viridis IV. He redirected the Vithara's own gradient, changed the frequency of the path it was following by altering the resonance of the endpoint. Using the warp field as an amplifier, the eye as the modulator, and 300 years of the Vithara's own momentum as the force that drove the redirect home. The current didn't stop. It turned. And not sharply. Nothing this vast turns sharply, but with the slow, inevitable grace of a deep ocean current finding a new channel. The Vithara's crossing pressure deflected away from the thinning membrane above Viridis IV and redirected toward a region of empty space 40 light-years distant, where no planet offered a resonant anchor, where the membrane was thick and old, and where the gradient would dissipate harmlessly into the dimensional substrate over the next several centuries. The membrane above Viridis IV held, then thickened. Then the anchor points the Vithara had already established in this universe's subspace. Those cold fingers Strange had felt pressing through, released. Not dramatically, not with any sound or light that the bridge's instruments detected. They simply withdrew. If following the redirected gradient, the way roots follow water, the patient inevitability of a living system following its nature. Strange became aware that he was on his knees. He didn't remember going down. The cloak had cushioned it. The stabilization reflex it had deployed had apparently reached its limits approximately 3 seconds before the redirect completed, and his body had made the decision that the floor was an acceptable position without consulting him. His hands were flat on the bridge deck. The eye hung below him on its chain, still glowing, dimmer now, the pulse slow and deep and exhausted. The tremor in his left hand had spread to both hands. His whole body was shaking with the fine, constant vibration of a system that had been operating at 340% capacity and was now in the process of discovering what that meant. Hey, Picard was beside him. Strange wasn't sure when that had happened. Dr. Strange. Picard's voice was steady, close, carrying the particular quality of a commander who had seen people push past their limits and knew how to be present without overwhelming. The membrane is holding. Viridis IV's readings are stabilizing. Whatever you did, redirect, Strange said. His voice was rougher than he expected. Successful. The Vithara is following the new gradient. It can't reverse it now. The momentum is too great. He looked up. The view screen showed the anomaly. No longer bending the stars. No longer amber. The region of space above Viridis IV was simply space again. Stars in their correct positions. The membrane invisible and intact and thick with restored equilibrium. It's done. Troy was there too. Strange felt her empathic attention settle around him like something warm, not intruding, not reading, simply present, the specific skill of someone who knew when presence mattered more than information. Crusher to bridge, the doctor's voice came through the comm, sharp with professional concern. I'm reading significant neural stress indicators from the bridge engineering station. Someone needs to come to sickbay. I'm fine, Strange said automatically. You're on the floor, Worf observed from tactical, with the tone of a warrior providing tactical assessment. I'm fine and on the floor, Strange amended. There's a distinction. Picard looked at him with the expression of a man who had decided to choose his battles and had just chosen this one. Dr. Strange, you are going to sickbay. Strange looked at the view screen, at the ordinary stars above an ordinary planet where 400,000 people would wake tomorrow to a world that had stopped breathing in its sleep, that had returned to geological stability overnight, that had been quietly, invisibly saved by a collaboration between a sorcerer from another universe and a starship crew who had learned dimensional mechanics in a single afternoon. He thought about arguing. He decided against it. Fine, he said, but I'm walking. He stood. It took longer than it should have, and the cloak helped more than he would have preferred. But he stood. Sickbay was quieter than Strange expected for the aftermath of a near catastrophe. Dr. Crusher worked with the efficient calm of someone who had treated the impossible often enough to have developed protocols for it, or at least the professional grace to invent protocols in real time without letting the patient see the invention happening. She ran her medical tricorder over Strange with the focused attention of a physician encountering a nervous system that had been used in ways nervous systems weren't designed for and was now presenting her with readings she had no precedent to interpret. Your neural pathway stress indicators are off every scale I have, she said, not accusingly. Medically, the way a diagnostician states a finding rather than a judgment. That's consistent with what happened, Strange said. And he was sitting on the bio bed with the careful stillness of someone who had assessed that stillness was currently the most productive available option. The tremor in both hands had settled back to its baseline. The familiar constant of the left index finger, the occasional catch in the right, which he took as evidence that the acute overload had passed, and what remained was simply his ordinary damage operating at ordinary levels. I can treat the inflammation, Crusher said. The deeper pathway stress, the myelin degradation in the fine motor cortices, that's going to take time. Days probably, maybe longer. She lowered the tricorder and looked at him with the directness of a doctor who had decided her patient could handle honesty. You pushed your nervous system past what it was designed to carry. Whatever you were before, she gestured at his hands indicating the scars, the history encoded in them. This didn't help. It rarely does, Strange said, but it completed. Crusher held his gaze for a moment. Then she reached for the regenerative instrument she'd selected and began the careful work of addressing what she could address. And Strange allowed it with the practiced patience of a man who had spent years learning that the body's needs were data to be respected rather than inconveniences to be overridden. Picard arrived 20 minutes later. He came alone, which Strange had not expected. No first officer, no security, no diplomatic formality. He pulled a chair to the side of the biobed and sat with the ease of a man who had spent considerable time in this room and had made his peace with what it represented. Crusher acknowledged him with a nod and moved to the far end of sickbay to give them the privacy the moment clearly required. Veritas 4's geological readings have been stable for 3 hours, Picard said. The fissure pattern is closing. Dr. Crusher's geological consultant confirms that the subsidence has stopped completely. He paused. The inhabitants are attributing it to a natural correction. They don't know what happened. Good, Strange said. They don't need to. The Federation Science Council will need a report, Picard said. I've been attempting to draft one for the past 2 hours. I find that standard report formats are somewhat inadequate to the content. I imagine the section on methodology is challenging. The section on methodology is currently titled See Attached, and the attachment doesn't exist yet. Something moved in Picard's expression. The dry acknowledgement of a man finding the absurdity in an extraordinary situation, the specific humor of someone who took things seriously enough to occasionally laugh at them. Then it settled into something more earnest. Dr. Strange, what you did today, what you built with my crew in 9 hours, with no preparation, in a universe with a completely different energy architecture, was remarkable. Geordi has been in engineering for the past hour, attempting to document it, and informing me periodically that the documentation keeps generating more questions than it answers. That's accurate to the experience, Strange said. Data, Picard continued, has begun what he estimates will be a 14-month research program into the dimensional membrane mechanics you described. He has asked me to ask you if you would be willing to review his preliminary framework before, Picard paused, before any decisions are made about your situation. Strange was quiet for a moment. Outside the sickbay viewport, stars moved at impulse speed. The Enterprise in motion again, heading back toward Federation space, won the routine of a ship that had survived the extraordinary and was returning to the ordinary with the professional resilience of a crew that had done this before. My situation, Strange said. The breach that brought you here, Picard said carefully, is closed. The Vathara's crossing destabilized it further during the redirect, and when the membrane above Veritas 4 thickened, he paused, choosing his words with the precision of a man delivering unwelcome information to someone who deserved it without softening. It's sealed, completely. Data's analysis suggests the membrane at that location is now among the thickest in this region of space. The redirect reinforced it. Another pause. There is no breach to return through. Strange absorbed this. He had known it was a possibility. And he had known it during the redirect, had felt the membrane thickening around the closure point in the same moment he felt the Vathara's gradient deflect, had understood in the abstract, operational part of his mind that was always running the secondary calculation, that sealing the breach and sealing his way home were the same action. He had made the choice anyway, because 400,000 people and an intact membrane in a universe that didn't have a sanctum network to replace it were not negotiable against his own preferences. He had made the choice. He was sitting with it now. There may be other options, Picard said. Q has not contacted us since the deployment, but his departure was... Q's departures are never final. The Q Continuum's awareness of dimensional membrane mechanics, combined with what Data is beginning to understand, may eventually constitute a path, Strange said. Yes, eventually. Picard was quiet. He had the particular quality of stillness that Strange had come to recognize as his form of respect. The absence of empty reassurance, the willingness to let difficult truths exist in the room without rushing to cover them with comfort. I should tell you, Picard said after a moment, that in the Federation, there is no category for what you are. We have encountered beings of extraordinary ability, entities of godlike power, travelers from parallel timelines. We have protocols for most of them. He leaned forward slightly. We don't have a protocol for a Sorcerer Supreme, a human being who carries the accumulated dimensional residue of 47 reality layers and who spent an afternoon teaching my chief engineer the fundamental mechanics of the universe. A pause. I find, however, that the absence of a protocol is not the absence of a welcome. Strange looked at him. At this particular man, in this particular universe, this precise, careful, formidably intelligent person who had listened to everything Strange said with complete attention and responded with complete honesty, who had given him his crew's trust on 9 hours acquaintance, who had sat beside him in a sickbay chair without ceremony or agenda to deliver difficult news with the dignity it deserved. He thought of Wong, of the sanctum's cold corridors and the smell of old books, and the specific weight of Earth's magical protection as a felt presence rather than an abstraction. He thought of the work that would be going undone while he was here, the seams that needed monitoring, the breaches that needed closing, the slow, constant labor of maintaining the dimensional integrity of a reality that never stopped trying to come apart at its edges. He thought about what Picard had built, what this crew had built, a civilization that had looked at the stars and gone toward them, not with weapons as its primary instrument, but with curiosity, and had found in that curiosity something that looked, from certain angles, remarkably like hope. It wasn't so different, he thought, from what the Sanctum was trying to do, keeping the darkness at bay, making space for people to live their lives without knowing how many impossible things were happening on their behalf. He flexed his left hand once, felt the tremor, felt the damage, familiar as his own name, the record of who he had been before and who he had become after. I'll review Data's preliminary framework, Strange said. Picard nodded once, with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had hoped for exactly that answer and had not allowed himself to expect it. There's one other thing, Strange said. The Vathara is following the redirect gradient, but it has been moving through dimensional membranes for an estimated 3 centuries in my universe alone. This redirect will hold for decades, possibly longer, but the entity itself still exists, still moves. And at some point, the redirect gradient will dissipate, and it will find a new path of least resistance. He met Picard's eyes. Your universe doesn't have a sanctum. It doesn't have masters. It doesn't have anyone watching the membranes. Until now, Picard said. Strange looked at him for a long moment. Until now, he agreed. Outside the sickbay viewport, the stars moved with the steady indifference of a universe going about its vast, complicated business. Membranes thickening and thinning, gradients shifting, the slow dimensional weather of a reality that had no idea it was being watched over and wouldn't have cared if it did. That was the nature of the work. It didn't ask to be appreciated. It didn't promise gratitude or recognition or any of the ordinary currencies of a life well spent. It simply needed doing, and by someone who understood what needed doing and was willing to be in the place it needed doing in. Strange had never been particularly good at being anywhere other than where the work was. He lay back on the biobed and let Dr. Crusher's instruments do what they could for nerves that had carried more than they were built for. The eye of Agamotto rested against his chest, its pulse slow and deep and steady. No longer searching, no longer adapting, no longer trying to orient itself in an unfamiliar substrate. Settled, present. Home was a membrane away, and the membrane was sealed. And somewhere in the Q continuum, a being of infinite capacity was sitting with genuine uncertainty for possibly the first time in its existence. And Data was in his quarters generating 14 months of research questions. And LaForge was in engineering, documenting a branch of physics that didn't have a name yet. And 400,000 people on a world below were sleeping through a geological stability they would never know had been purchased for them. And in the spaces between things, in the dimensional membrane that threaded through this universe like a nervous system through a body, something old and vast and patient was moving along a new gradient, redirected, unhurried, following the path of least resistance toward empty space, 40 light years away. For now. Strange closed his eyes. The stars moved on outside. The Enterprise carried him, steady and certain, through the dark between them. The work, as always, was just beginning. Dr. Stephen Strange had arrived in the wrong universe through the right accident, pulled through a dimensional membrane by a force that operated on scales that made human intention look like a suggestion, deposited aboard a starship crewed by people who had decided, as a civilization, that the correct response to the unknown was curiosity rather than fear. He had found in that crew something he hadn't expected. Not the mystical framework he was trained in, not the dimensional architecture he understood in his nervous system, but something that functioned like those things through entirely different means. LaForge had built dimensional mechanics with engineering tools. Data had cataloged the uncategorizable with patient precision. And Picard had listened to impossible things and responded with the most radical act available to a rational mind. Genuine openness. The Vithara was redirected. The membrane held. Veritas 4 would endure. But the breach home was sealed, and the membranes of this universe had no guardian. And Strange had never been able to leave unfinished work in a room he knew was there. Somewhere, Q was thinking. Somewhere, a 14-month research program was generating its first questions. And in the deep dimensional substrate of a universe that had never needed a Sorcerer Supreme until now, something ancient was already moving toward its next threshold. The watch had changed. The darkness remained. Strange was still here.